Hi, my name's Mark Calderon, and this is the first of the lectures for Introduction to Moral Philosophy. And I wanted to begin just by explaining the aim of these lectures. And the aim, of course, is to provide you with an introduction to moral philosophy, but we'll be doing so in a specific way. Specifically, we'll be trying to introduce ourselves to moral philosophy through a close examination of two key historical texts. Specifically, we'll be looking at David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature and Immanuel Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. And really, our objective here is to provide you with an in-depth understanding of both these texts and to provide you with a sufficient basis for further study of both Hume and Kant as well as moral philosophy more generally. Now, in general, I'm loath to recommend secondary literature. The literature on these topics are vast and complex. And for now, especially for a beginning student, right, your time is really better spent thinking about and trying to understand Hume and Kant rather than trying to understand their commentators. However, right, if extra guidance is required, I do have two recommendations. Both of these recommendations are on the Moodle site. The first is written by John Rawls, a very famous political philosopher, lectures on the history of moral philosophy. The second is written by David Wiggins, a famous moral philosopher, and although he's made important contributions in other areas, such as philosophy of language, uh, but David Wiggins' book is called Ethics, 12 Lectures on the Philosophy of Morality. Now, both of these books are based on a course of lectures like this one, and both lecture series have the same basic aim, right? To introduce moral philosophy through a close reading of key historical texts. But, there are going to be crucial differences. My interpretation of Kant and Hume isn't always going to conform to the interpretations they give, and the interpretations they give don't always conform to one another. So, whom are you to trust? Right? That's an obvious question. Well, only the text itself is authoritative, right? And my lectures and any secondary literature you might consult are really only supplements or aids to your own reading and understanding of these texts. And so it's really Hume and Kant who really should have the final say about the content of their doctrine. Okay. Why introduce moral philosophy through key historical texts? Okay. There's really two ways you can teach this kind of course, right? You can either do a survey of topics in moral philosophy, or you can do a kind of historical introduction. And these, of course, can vary depending on your choices of figures to focus on. Now, part of the reason for going the historical route rather than the topical route is pragmatic. For many of you who will continue to be interested in moral philosophy, will go on and take more courses in the program. And our second year course is organized topically, and there's a real danger of overlap, right? Uh, Another kind of pragmatic reason is that Hume and Kant are like fantastically influential. Uh, you'll see their ideas popping up all over the place, even in really contemporary philosophy. It's really good to have these under your belt, and so you can be prepared to deal with the way their ideas evolve in later thinkers. Um, but Kant himself provides a rationale for this, and so let's have a look at what Kant has to say. And if you'll just give me a moment, let's share this. All right, so here's Kant on why we should study the history of philosophy. He says, we can only learn to philosophize, that is, to exercise the talent of reason in accordance with its universal principles, on certain actually existing attempts at philosophies, always, however, reserving the light of reason to investigate, to confirm, or to reject these principles in their very sources. Uh, Now, when learning to philosophize about morality or any other topic, it's useful, as Kant says, to study actual existing attempts at philosophy, right? Just as if you were studying music, right? You wanted to learn music. It would be useful to uh, study actual existing attempts at producing music. Okay. Uh, so we will be studying not just actually existing attempts at studying uh, uh, actual existing attempts at moral philosophy, uh, but we'll be studying the attempts of great historical figures. And here's a quote from Rawls, if you'll allow me to read it to you, right? He says, all the great figures lie to some degree beyond us, no matter how hard we try to master their thought. With Kant, this difference often seems to me somehow much greater. Like great composers or great artists, Mozart and Beethoven, Poussin and Turner, they're beyond envy. So, look, we'll be reading what are undoubtedly philosophical masterpieces and indeed masterpieces of Western literature more generally. And this is not to say that there are no problems with the views they propound. Okay. Remember, Kant insisted that we should reserve the light of reason to investigate, to confirm, or to reject these very principles at their sources, in their very sources. So, without quelling our suspicion, we should nevertheless pursue it with respect, right? Hume and Kant are undoubtedly much smarter than we are. If we think we see a problem, they've likely spotted it as well. When examining these difficulties, we should always try to endeavor to find out their way out of these difficulties, even if it's different from our way out of similar difficulties. And really, it's only after trying our best to understand their views and how they might respond to certain difficulties that might arise with them that we're going to be in a position in the end to make up our own minds. Okay, uh, I want to talk about how to prepare for this course. Um, I think one of the most important things that you can learn in university is to learn how to learn. Uh, at some point in your life, there's going to be something that's going to be important for you to learn, right? Maybe you're going to start up a business and you need to familiarize yourself with tax law, or maybe you take up some hobby, say music, and you need to learn harmony or what have you, right? Uh, if anything, that you should learn at university is you should learn how to learn. Okay, so I'm going to explain what the optimal ways to prepare for this course are, and I'll leave it up to you to decide for yourself. Okay. But before I talk about how to specifically prepare for this course, I want to talk about a little bit about learning in general. Okay. And the first observation I want to make is about the psychology of learning. And, whenever you set out to learn something, in effect, you're deliberately placing yourself outside of your comfort zone. Okay. That's really important to appreciate, right? We're comfortable when we know things, when we understand things, and we're uncomfortable when we're ignorant or when we don't understand what's going on. That can be a very stressful situation. But look, the only reason you're setting out to learn something is because you don't know or you don't understand something and you want to gain that knowledge or gain that understanding, right? So you've got to cope with deliberately putting yourself outside of your comfort zone, okay? Um, and it's just important to bear in mind, and I'll come back to this, how this observation might be relevant, but it's important to bear in mind because this can trigger like a fight or flight response, right? If you're reading something and you're really not understanding it, right, you might think, "Ugh, whatever, right, and give up, right? Or you might think, wow, this is really challenging. I'm going to have to roll up my sleeves and do some work if I'm going to figure this out. That would be the fight response as opposed to the flight response. Okay. Uh, but whatever, learning involves, being conscious of what you don't understand and trying to gain that understanding and mastery, learning involves being deliberately putting yourself outside of your comfort zone. Okay, that was just an observation. Again, we'll come back to that. The second thing I wanted to do is, well, how do you learn? Well, I just want to point out a couple things, right? Uh, uh, um, you, uh, repeat repeated active engagement with the material is how you learn, right? And moreover, repeated active engagement with material that you've chunked into digestible bits. Okay. uh, so uh, I don't know, let's what would be a good example? All right, so uh, here's the uh, cycle of fourths, right? It's C, F, B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat, G flat, B, E, A, D, G. Okay. Now, suppose I told you to memorize the cycle of fourths, right? Well, that's a lot of note names, right? You might think, that's hard, right? Well, the way to make it easier, of course, is to chunk it into memorable bits, right? And notice there's a little pattern there, right? We've got a BEADG. Let's just try to remember that as this funny word BG, right? So we got 3 bits. We got CF, we've got the first sequence of BEADG, BG, but they're flatted. And then the second sequence of this where they're not flatted. Okay, all you have to remember is CF and BG, 2 sequences of BG, and the first is flatted. There you go. You've just learned the cycle of force. Uh, how does one do that? Again, in part by chunking things into bite-sized material. Okay, I'll come back to why that's an important thing in preparation later. Okay, so how do you prepare for this course? Well, uh, obviously, you should do the required reading ahead of time. And let me begin with explaining how you should be doing the reading. There's not the required reading. might be difficult because it's older historical texts and it's got strange language, right? But the actual amount isn't very much. Okay, that's important because I want you to go through it twice before the lecture. So ideally, you begin with a quick first pass. Um, it's not a skim because when you skim things, you scan through the page looking for important points, read those, and then keep scanning for the next important point. Okay. So you're only selectively attending to part of the text, right? I don't want you to do that. But what I do want you to do is give yourself permission not to understand the text in the first run and just read through it the way you might read through a kind of novel. So, no stopping when you come to a sentence or idea you don't understand, just go through it. Now, uh, I want you to do so with a certain purpose in mind, though, right? Namely, you'll be asking, well, what is this author doing? Right? You know, there's lots of things an author might be doing, right? They might be giving an argument, right? But they also might be describing a problem or engaging in certain kind of rhetoric directed at their predecessors, or there's lots of things, right? What you should be doing is with the quick read through is just to get the lay of the land and try to identify the overall structure. What is happening? Like, just what are they doing, right? So if the author in the assigned reading was trying to argue for a thesis and giving two arguments for it, uh, hopefully you should um, have some idea of what that thesis is, and at the very least know that there are two arguments, even if you can't really reproduce what they are. Okay. All right, so now you've done this quick read, and you got to ask yourself, well, um, now you have to go back through and read it more slowly and carefully, right? Now you know what's happening in the text. He's arguing for this thesis and he's giving two arguments for it. Okay, so you should try to figure out what that thesis is and be able to write it down, right? So you should note where in the text that thesis is stated and note any kind of variations that might be given and see if they're important or not, and see if you can uh, understand what the two arguments are, right? And try your hand at just in bullet point fashion jotting down very quickly what these might be, right? Now, obviously, this is difficult material, and even going through it twice, you might not know what's going on, right? Luckily, right, you've got my lectures as a guide, right? So you've done the two readings, you listen to my lecture, and then, and this is really important, the third step is to go back, right, and see if you can find the material that I discussed in my lecture in the text. If you can't match what's happening in the lecture with what's happening in the text, there's a problem, and that will give you something to talk about in the subsequent seminar. Okay, so summarizing, three passes, right? Uh, One quick pass, not a skim, but quick to discover the structure of what's going on in the text. A second, more close reading, trying to work out what more specifically is happening. Uh, Jot down any remaining confusions. Go to the lecture. You know, listen to what I have to say, see if you can see it in the text that after you've listened to the lecture, and if there's remaining difficulties, well, now you've got material for seminar. Okay, one other thing about how to prepare for this class, And this is notes, okay? It's very important to take notes. And it's not only important to take notes, but it's important to take notes in a certain way. And here I've got to remind you about how the setting out to learn something, you're putting yourself outside of your comfort zone. I think one reason some people don't take notes is because it's hard. They feel a little bit more comfortable just listening. They feel like if I just listen unencumbered with this task, I can understand it better, right? That's a mistake. They feel that they can understand it better because it's more comfortable, right? But the fact that you're comfortable means that you're not really learning it. Now, here's how I think you should take notes, and this is why. I'll also explain why, right? Many people have a really good facility with a keyboard, and they're capable of transcribing speech, right? You just sit there without much effort, okay? Now, there have been study after study after study about note taking, and they all show pretty consistent results. And the results uh, uh, are that taking notes by hand is much, 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 much better, right? Not only is there an increase in short-term memory of the material, there's a marked increase in long-term memory of the material. And what's important for us is there's also an increase in conceptual comprehension of the material, right? And so let me just talk about note-taking by uh, hand, right? Now, it's kind of hard because you can't write by hand as fast as you can type. So there's no way you're going to be transcribing word for word what I'm saying, right? Um, uh, Now, there's some things you can do to make it easier. You can adopt a system of abbreviations, for example, and this will facilitate your note taking. However, it won't help enough to get up to transcription speed. So you're not going to be able to transcribe word for word what I'm saying. It's okay. You'll have these lectures on video anyway, right? Um, what you need to do is uh, listen, make a judgment as to what's relevant and important, find a way to quickly summarize it, all the while continuing to listen because I'm not going to stop talking, right? Uh, that's hard, right? Um, I think that's why people don't do it. But because it's hard, right? Because you have to listen to what someone's saying, physically write down after making a judgment about its relevance, as well as a judgment about how to summarize it while continuing to listen, because that's so hard of an attention task, uh, that's why it's such an effective method of learning, right? It's because you're actively, really actively engaged in this material. So despite it being fraught, which again is why I think people avoid taking notes by hand, that's also precisely why it's such an effective mechanism for learning. And again, huge increase in short-term, long-term memory, but also in conceptual comprehension. Uh, uh, Even if you think this material isn't something that you really want to be committed to, it's really important to learn how to take notes, and you might as well start with this class. Okay, so those are my recommendations: 3-pass reading and note taking by hand. Okay, now let me relate this back to chunking. If you do these tasks week by week, right, uh, there's not that much reading, right? 5, 10 pages. You should be able to get through those reading tasks. Uh, if you've taken notes by hand, and again, Another useful step in note taking would be having done it by hand, then retype them up so they're clean. And while what it's good to do that while your memory's fresh, in case um, your your abbreviations are difficult to decode later. So go ahead and retype them at the night. So that's another engagement point. Um, so uh, uh, um, um, uh, uh, but if you do these weekly tasks, doing the 3 readings, taking the notes, right, you'll be actively engaging with a small bit of the overall material of the course on a regular basis. When it comes to exam time, then you don't have to cram, right? You'll kind of already know the stuff, right? And you'll most have to do is a brief review of your notes and maybe uh, look at some past exam questions and try your hand at answering them. You might have to briefly look at key passages from the reading, but you wouldn't have to necessarily reread everything. So if you do the work on a consistent, regular basis, revision for your exam will be a breeze. If you don't, well, you'll end up cramming. You won't retain this material. Perhaps you'll get a second class mark, but there's no hope of getting a first class mark. It's much better to do the work on a consistent, regular basis, and that's what I recommend you to do. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about today is just to begin to talk a little bit about the project of the treatise. We'll start in earnest talking about Hume's treatise next time. Um, but before we do, just want to talk a little bit about how uh, how um, citations will work. So let me share the screen. Okay, there we go. So uh, first of all, you don't have to use this particular edition of the treatise. There's also a smaller edition by Selby Big. Either one will work. This, however, is the official scholarly version. Okay, what I wanted to explain is how citations is going to work. Well, um, in the treatise, it's divided into books, parts, and sections. Okay, so the first number of the sequence is going to be the book. The second number is going to be part, and the third number is going to be a section. Now, occasionally, I will include a fourth number, and when I do, that's going to be the paragraph number of the section. The David Fate Norton edition, the Norton and Norton edition, uh, uh, helpfully provides the paragraph numbers. The Selby Big doesn't, but the sections are short. If I refer, for example, to the 8th paragraph of a certain section, you should be able to count it out and find it. So anyway, that's what these strings of numbers mean. Um, and um, Look, the main material on ethics and Hume's treatise is in book 3, but it depends on certain background material that occurred in books 1 and 2. And so we're going to begin with book 1 and proceed from there. So now I want to talk about the project of the treatise. Uh, and the subtitle's interesting or revealing, and it's worth remembering these things that paying attention to these little things that might seem as if they're literary ephemera, but sometimes they can be revealing, right? So the subtitle of the treatise is being an attempt to introduce experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. Okay, right. So he's telling us. We don't have to figure out, he's telling us what he's doing, right? So inspired by Newton's success in deploying the experimental method in natural philosophy, Hume endeavored to introduce the experimental method into philosophy. And just as the experimental method in natural philosophy, and there, by that term, Hume means uh, things like mechanics and astronomy, the study of nature more generally. The term science didn't really exist till the 19th century. So Hume understand. So just as the deployment of experimental method in natural philosophy yielded positive results, Hume thinks the deployment of experimental method in what he calls moral philosophy would yield positive results as well. Now, a remark about Hume's use of the term moral philosophy. It's important to recognize the meanings of words can change. People can use words in special ways. Let me give an example of meaning of words changing. This is Rawls' example. Uh, Charles II, upon visiting Christopher Wren's cathedral, described it as awful and artificial. Now, to modern ears, right, that sounds like a negative verdict, right? Uh, However, awful meant full of awe, right, as opposed to terrible. Uh, and by artificial, he didn't mean fake or unreal, but rather the product of artifice. And in effect, what Charles II was saying was, wow, isn't it amazing, right, that this product of human artifice could be so awe-inspiring, right, like the way God's creations can be awe-inspiring. Uh, uh, so, in this case, moral philosophy, he doesn't mean ethics. He rather means the study of human nature, of which ethics is going to be a part. Okay, so Hume believed that the introduction of experimental method and the establishment of a science of human nature was necessary in order to resolve apparently fruitless debates in philosophy. And instead of pursuing these disagreements, seemingly endless disagreements directly, Hume thought that, look, progress could be made if we first become, and here's Hume, thoroughly acquainted with the extent and force of human understanding. And to do so, we should, and again, here's Hume, explain the nature of the ideas we employed and of the operations we perform in our reasoning. So it's only once we understand the origin of our ideas and the operations that we perform with these ideas that we can understand what we can reasonably expect to know about other subject matters. Okay, so it's in that specific sense that Hume describes moral philosophy as the science of human nature as the capital of the sciences, right? Because once we understand the origin of our ideas and our operations with them, then we can understand what we can reasonably know about other things, and then we can reasonably pursue those other inquiries, right? That's the sense in which the science of human nature is meant to be the capital of the sciences. Now, the new natural philosophy given its experimental method, is based on observation, but wasn't a mere summary of observations. Uh, a natural philosopher legitimately generalizes their observations. Moreover, they try to appeal to a limited number of principles, right, that can explain the greatest number of observed phenomena. Similarly, right, the moral philosopher, in Hume's sense, the scientist of human nature, uh, is going to be based on observations that they make. But they're not going to be content with merely summarizing these observations, right? Like the natural philosopher, they're going to feel free to generalize, right, their observations. And moreover, they're kind of looking for a limited number of principles that are going to be able to explain the greatest number of observed phenomena. So, um, um, uh, um, and though, right, both the natural and moral philosophers, they're trying to generalize their observations in an attempt to discover, fundamental and comprehensive principles that will explain the full range of observed phenomena. Um, they cannot hope to transcend experience to discover the ultimate super sensible nature of things. Okay, and this is really going to be a big Humean theme, especially in book one. Um, and though uh, so natural and moral philosophy, they're both based on observation on the experimental method, as Hume puts it, but there's an important difference, right? Uh, a natural philosopher can interrogate nature, as Bacon put it. That is, they can conduct experiments under controlled conditions, right? That's what interrogating nature meant. Uh, However, in moral philosophy, no such interrogation is possible, right? The moral philosopher can't conduct, right, experiments under controlled conditions, right? Rather, they're limited to what, as Hume described it, as cautious observation of human life. Nevertheless, he thinks these cautious observations uh, um, are sufficient to establish this new science of human nature. Um, okay, right. So um, let me switch to the screen sharing again. All right. So a central goal of the treatise is to explain the origin of certain kinds of ideas and impression. Book one is going to describe the origin of certain important ideas of space and time, necessary connection, of external objects, of the self. Book two is going to discuss the origin of certain impressions of reflections. I know that's a technical term, but he just means things like passions, desire, and the will. And book three is going to discuss the origin of moral distinctions, such as the distinction of vice and virtue. Uh, and Hume's going to argue that moral distinctions are going to depend upon certain impressions. Now, Hume's project in moral philosophy, and this is very important, is descriptive and explanatory, as opposed to being prescriptive and justatory. So Hume doesn't seek to prescribe certain moral judgments. So he thinks common morality is more or less fine as it stands, though perhaps susceptible to certain refinements and extensions. Rather, Hume seeks to describe how we come to make the moral judgments that we in fact make. Hume seeks to explain the origin of our moral distinctions rather than to justify these distinctions. Though there's a twist, because at the very end, Hume signals that once we recognize the proper explanation of the moral distinctions that we make, we'll be all the more pleased to make them. But we'll come back to that at the very end. Now, moreover, and importantly, Hume wants a certain kind of explanation, right, of our moral distinctions, right? He wants a naturalistic explanation, right? So he's trying to give an account of human morality as a natural phenomena, as arising from human nature and our place in nature. So he rejects any attempt, for example, to give a theological foundation to morality of a kind that natural law theorists such as Locke and Pufendorf had recommended. Now, Hutchinson, who was kind of a mentor to Hume, famously complained that Hume's moral science lacked sufficient warmth in the cause of virtue. And Hume responds in the treatise, right? And he says that we've got to consider the human mind that gives rise to moral distinctions. So allow me to read this lengthy quote from Hume. You can approach these distinctions, he says, either as an anatomist or as a painter, either to discover its most secret springs and principles, or to describe the grace and beauty of its actions. I imagine it impossible to conjoin these two views. Where you pull off the skin and display all the minute parts, there appears something trivial, even in the noblest attitude and most vigorous actions. Nor can you ever render the object graceful or engaging but by clothing the parts again with skin and flesh and presenting only their bare outside. An anatomist, however, can give very good advice to a painter or a statuary. And in like manner, I'm persuaded that a metaphysician can be very helpful to a moralist, though I cannot easily conceive of these two characters united in the same work. Any warm sentiment of morals, I'm afraid, would have the air of declamation amidst abstract reasonings, and would be esteemed contrary to good taste. And though I'm much more ambitious of being a friend of virtue than a writer of taste, yet I must always carry the latter in my eye, otherwise I must despair of ever being serviceable to virtue. Okay, so this was from letter 17, and this wasn't the treatise, I'm sorry. This was from letter 17 of September 1739. Um, okay, so he's thinking of the scientist of human nature in deploying the experimental method, in trying to understand the moral distinctions that we make and the origins of our moral ideas as an anatomist. Okay. Uh, maybe, right, a priest, right, offering a sermon, right, uh, will offer warm rhetoric urging people to be virtuous, but that's not Hume's job. His job is to describe and to explain our moral distinctions. Okay, one last thing then. We're going to, let me very quickly talk about some of the elements of Hume's psychology. Uh, um, uh, and we'll pick up with Hume in earnest next time. But it's worth sharing just a little bit at this point. So let me share the screen again. All right, so Book one of the treatise ends on a note of despair. He writes, but before I launch out into these immense depths of philosophy which lie before me, I find myself inclined to stop a moment in my present station and to ponder the voyage which I have undertaken, and which undoubtedly requires the utmost art and industry to be brought to a happy conclusion. And here's the important bit. Methinks I'm like a man who've been struck on many shoals and having narrowly escaped shipwreck in passing a small frith, has yet the temerity to put out to sea in the same leaky, weather-beaten vessel, and even carries his ambition so far as to think of compassing the globe under these disadvantageous circumstances. And the impossibility of amending or correcting these faculties reduces me almost to despair and makes me resolve to perish on the barren rock on which I am present, rather than venture myself upon the boundless ocean which runs out into immensity. Now, what is Hume despairing of? What he's despairing of is reasonable metaphysical speculation about the supersensible natures of things, such as the nature of the necessary connection between cause and effect. Now, if philosophy can't reasonably engage in such metaphysical speculation, well, what's there left for philosophy to do? Now, here it's important that his skepticism is limited to metaphysical speculation about the supersensible natures of things, right? Philosophy may not reasonably engage in such speculation, but through cautious observation, right, philosophy may nevertheless investigate human nature. And so the theory of the passions that he develops in book two is supposed to exemplify what can be done, right, in this new science of human nature, because certain passions, the indirect passions, are governed by a limited number of general principles that, again, can be discovered by the moral scientist. Now, so let me switch the screen again. Okay, right. So Hume calls whatever is present to the mind perceptions. He says, all the actions of seeing, hearing, judging, loving, hating, thinking fall under this denomination. So that's a technical term, right? Loving, hating, thinking all count as perceptions for Hume in Hume's technical sense. And he says these perceptions are of two kinds, right? They're either impressions or ideas. And he tells us that the impressions enter the mind with greater force or vivacity than the ideas, which are faint images of impressions. Now, impressions and ideas are either simple or complex. Simple perceptions, such as impressions of particular colors, he says, admit of no distinction or separation. In contrast, complex perceptions, impressions or ideas of Paris, say, are such that, constituent parts can be distinguished, right? So our impression of Paris includes the distinguishable sights and sounds of that city. Now, while Hume initially distinguishes impressions and ideas in terms of the force or vivacity with which they enter the mind, he makes the further important claim that simple ideas are causally dependent upon impressions that resemble them. And since complex ideas depend on simple ideas that are their constituents, complex ideas ultimately depend as well on the simple impressions from which their constituent simple ideas derive. And Hume describes this as the first principle in the science of human nature, that all of our simple ideas in their first appearance are derived from simple impressions which are corresponded to them and which they exactly represent. And this is sometimes called the copy principle. Um, uh, so, uh, our particular idea of colors resembles the impressions of these particular colors. So he says the idea of red, which we form in the dark, and that impression which strikes our eyes in sunshine differ only in degree, not in nature, right? Our idea of red, when we close our eyes and try to visualize redness, is like red, seeing red, but weaker, fainter, right, with less force or vivacity. Um, uh, Moreover, our ideas of particular colors causally depend on our impressions, right? If we didn't have the relevant impressions, if we'd never seen red, well, we wouldn't have our idea of red. So the idea causally depends, a simple idea is going to causally depend on the simple impression that it resembles. Um, Now, uh, so far, we've got this structure, right? At the very top, encompassing the contents of the mind are perceptions. Perceptions, again, are whatever can be set before the mind. These are either impressions or ideas. Impressions are more like sensory experiences. Our ideas are more like ideas formed on the basis of these sensory experiences. And impressions themselves divide into two kinds. There are impressions of sensation, and those are going to be the sensory experiences, sights and sounds and things like that. And impressions reflection are going to be uh, 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 things like passions, desires, or emotions. And those are going to be important for us since they're involved in Hume's account of the distinction between vice and virtues that we make. Uh, why does he call them? Uh, why does he call them um, impressions of reflection? Um, uh, well, here's the idea. Impressions and sensation are original impressions, right? They're copies of no other thing. They're just what pops into your mind, right? When you experience something. Uh, uh, so whereas impressions of sensation are original impressions in the sense that experience begins with them, impressions of reflections are secondary impressions in the sense that, as he says, they're derived in part from our ideas. Uh, so we initially experience a certain original impression. This gives rise to an idea that resembles that. This in turn gives rise to further impressions. Okay, it's easiest to see with an example. Okay, um, so suppose you smell rotten eggs. Okay, maybe there was a corner of the refrigerator you haven't looked into in a while. There was something in a storage container you open up. Oh, rotten eggs. Okay, so the smell of rotten eggs is a sensory impression. Okay, it's an impression of sensation. Right. Suppose you've never smelled rotten eggs before. Lucky you. Right. If you've never smelled rotten eggs before, you might people will tell you it smells bad, but you might really not, won't have an idea of the particular bad smell. But now that you've smelled rotten eggs, boy, do you have an idea of how they smell. Okay, so you form this idea of the smell of rotten eggs, Uh, and uh, and Hume's idea is that once you've formed this idea of the smell of rotten eggs, this idea in turn gives rise to a certain kind of feeling of aversion, a strong inclination to avoid smelling rotten eggs ever again. Now, this new feeling of aversion, right, is what Hume means by an impression of reflection. Okay, it's an impression that's occasioned by a certain idea, and that's why it's called an impression of reflection. But just like impressions of sensation, right? Uh, their original existences in the sense that they're copies of no other thing. They're not even copies of the idea that prompts them. The aversion, the feeling of ugh, that's not a copy of the idea. Uh, okay, so those are some brief remarks about the elements of Hume's philosophy of mind. This is going to be important because these are the terms in which she's going to offer his explanations going forward. And let's see. Right. So let's briefly look at what we've done. So in this lecture, I've touched on some key ideas from the introduction and from treaties 1.1.1 through 5. So that's book 1, section 1, or book 1, part 1, sections 1 through 5, rather. Next time, we've got two bits we're going to read, 2.1.15 and 2.1.11. Okay, so please read those. Now, in general, if you feel like you need some help, extracurricular help with Hume, uh, you could consult either the Rawls or the Wiggins, and I've both the introduction and Hume 1 and Hume 2 and Rawls, and chapters 1 and chapter 2 in Wiggins are about the Hume. And one last thing before I let you go. The Rawls and the Wiggins are kind of interesting. Rawls is really a Kantian, right? So he'll give a very, very sympathetic reading of Kant, perhaps less sympathetic of Hume. David Wiggins is Humean, and you'll see him doing the opposite, a very sympathetic reading of Hume, and perhaps a less sympathetic reading of Kant. So just buyer beware. So next time we'll begin looking at the material in from book 2. And thanks a lot. I'll see you next week.